I don't know if my parents are involved. I think if they are, then they should come clean.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Will any, quote, additional individuals, end quote, be charged, and should they be? Where we are right now, Gabby and Brian are both gone, but one set of parents are still refusing to talk about what happened. Is there any doubt that the United States Attorney's Office's reference to quote-unquote additional individuals are to Brian's parents, Chris and Roberta Laundrie? And if Brian's parents are the focus of an ongoing investigation and perhaps the reason so few details have been released to date, should they be charged? Well, with what? And is any of this in the interests of justice? What do you think? Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So, I don't think you need to be a true crime rocket scientist to see, even from a distance, that there were a few big red flags surrounding the Laundries. And we'll get to them in a second. But just broadly speaking, take where we are right now. Gabby is no longer with us. Brian is no longer with us. And there are a lot of unanswered questions. And who are in the best position to answer those questions, right? Well, the people who aren't willing to talk, the people who are refusing to cooperate, they are the people who last saw Brian. And so doesn't it make sense to want to approach them and find out what they know, and then under the circumstances that they don't want to say what they know, given that both of these individuals are no longer with us, how does that make sense? What are they hiding or protecting, if anything? Are they just trying to be, careful, looking after themselves? Are they just listening to their lawyer? Now, I think if you don't really think about this case, if you even a family member, and you're not really thinking about the Petito case, it's easy to be dismissive of everything and say, let's let it go. Let's put this behind us. But when you go through the information, then it becomes very difficult to do that, given what has actually happened and how it happened, right? So when we do that, when we look in no particular order, number one, Brian went straight from Spread Creek Camp in Wyoming, where Gabby's remains were left, home to his parents. Number two, obviously arrived home in Florida without Gabby, and obviously this ought to have led to questions from his parents, like, where's Gabby? And they were effectively Gabby's parents as well, or future parents-in-law as well, certainly when Gabby left on the trip. They also had a duty of care as parents to inform Gabby's parents that Gabby was no longer with their son, didn't they? Number three, but instead of contacting Gabby's parents when Brian returned, Brian and his parents lawyered up. Number four, instead of Brian's parents contacting law enforcement or calling 911 based on what they knew, it was up to Gabby's parents to call authorities based on what they didn't know. And were they right to call law enforcement? Well, it turned out they were. Number five, following the discovery of Gabby's remains, Brian's parents remained uncooperative with law enforcement and refused to say anything to the media or the public camped out on their lawn. Now, before we dig a little deeper into some of the above points, let's keep our eye on the ball in terms of the legalities. This is a case involving two deaths. The deceased are the future daughter-in-law of the Laundries, as well as their son. I don't know if one can argue that the moment Brian broke ties with Gabby, the Laundries could too. I don't know if one could say, no questions asked, under the circumstances that was reasonable. By the same token, in the aftermath, where both youngsters turned up deceased, one has to wonder what the Laundries knew, when they knew it, and whether their reluctance to engage with the authorities actually hindered the investigation. Bear in mind there were several phases. There was the phase where Gabby was missing but Brian wasn't. There was the phase where Gabby was missing but Brian wasn't, and the authorities were alerted by Gabby's family. There was the phase where Gabby was missing and Brian wasn't. Gabby's family had alerted authorities and Brian's family weren't saying anything, but Brian was still there. And then there was the phase where Brian disappeared. And then there was the phase where Gabby was found, no longer alive, right? And so throughout all of that, you have different phases of, well, why would you not say anything under these circumstances? Then the circumstances change. Well, why are you not saying anything now? Right? And so one's got to look at it within that perspective. And so instead of going through it via the rear view mirror, one's got to go chronologically, systematically through the timeline and link up not only the behavior of the parents or the lack of action, but actually what is going on behind the scenes, actually the conversations that were going on, actually the text messages, actually things that were spent, resources that were allocated a certain way, right? And so, put simply, had they cooperated, could they have saved Brian's life? Could it have led to Brian being apprehended, right? So, one has to wonder what the Laundries knew and how it could have changed the outcome had they passed on their knowledge to the authorities. In this respect, the actual timeline, as I say, becomes of material use and relevant. And I believe the FBI are doing exactly this, going through the timeline and trying to find out what happened without the help or assistance of the people at the center of this. In other words, they've got to indirectly find out what took place because the people at the center of this won't tell them. So you may have noticed that missing from the autopsies any mention about time of death. What day did Brian die? Did he die immediately after entering the park? Was he there for a couple of weeks? What is really going on? The other thing that's quite interesting with that is, did Brian take his life once he was made a person of interest, and did someone communicate that to him? But did Brian take his life after Gabby's remains were found? Did Brian not want Gabby's remains to be found, and once they were found, perhaps felt that he was found out in a particular way? So the timing of Brian taking his life is important, not only in respect to Brian's thinking and his motives, but also to the possibility that he was receiving assistance, whether in terms of communication or something else in some way. I mean, what was the burner phone for? The burner phone acquired just before he walked into the woods, right? So when we dig deeper into this case, it does raise important questions such as, when exactly did the Laundries lawyer up? So you can imagine if Brian arrived home on September the 1st and they lawyered up either on September the 1st or September the 2nd, that is a different situation to them lawyering up kind of when the police knock on their door, right? It's like, wow, what's going on here? If they lawyered up immediately, it suggests that they knew something, they had inside knowledge immediately as well. What are the implications of that? Well, it's difficult to say. Then the other thing is, what was the purpose of this burner phone purchased at an AT&T store on September 14? And apparently it was accompanied by an older woman. Well, what else is the purpose of a phone other than communication? And September 14 was a critical time in the timeline. And who assisted Brian with this purchase, given that, he had to steal money just to get home? So was he assisted in that purchase? And what was that purchase for? And who was aware of the number that he got from this particular phone? And then what role, if any, did Cassie have in the events? And when I did cover Cassie earlier, I've sort of mentioned a statement she made, which was later removed online, that seemed to contradict itself to some extent when she made a second statement. So one wonders, is there anything that Cassie has to answer for? And is she part of this question of additional individuals? It's hard to say. In regards to the first question, we know that when the Northport cops knocked on the Laundries' door on September 11th, after Gabby's parents had called 911 the same day, and this was after a long period during which the Laundries refused to speak to Gabby's parents about where she was or what they knew. Brian's parents handed the cops a lawyer's phone number. That was sort of one could almost say that was their sole action to help, the situation. Of course, one can talk about them going into the park at the request of the authorities, but from the time that the cops were involved until Brian was later found, because that was when Brian's parents went into the park. Basically, all they did was they provided the lawyer's phone number, not much besides that. And that lawyer, that number given to the cops at the door, belonged to Steve Bertolino, a New York-based attorney specializing in real estate, and he was a longtime friend of the Laundrie family, based in Long Island, New York, which is where Brian grew up, and also Gabby's family were based initially. So 4 days after this, 4 days after September 11, when Gabby's parents called 911, the Northport Police Chief Todd Garrison pleaded directly and publicly with Bertolino, asking for help. And so he posted this on Twitter on September 15th. He said, "Mr. Stephen Bertolino, the Northport Police needs your help in finding Gabby Petito. Please call us to arrange a conversation with Brian Laundrie. 2 people left on a trip and 1 person returned, !" Hashtag where's Gabby, hashtag find Gabby, hashtag Gabby Petito. And so Bertolino's response was to advise his clients not to speak to authorities. In other words, not to cooperate with the investigation. I think it was the same day, September 15th, nearly 3 weeks after Gabby disappeared, Brian was named a person of interest. And it was only sometime after that Brian was sort of, an arrest warrant was put out, and he was sort of being sought for kind of financial fraud, right? And so you can see that law enforcement were really treating Brian kind of quite moderately. They weren't really pursuing him for other crimes. They were kind of treating him with kid gloves in a way, right? And this was perhaps in a way perhaps to reassure his parents that they were not rushing to judgment, and that if Brian was innocent, or if Brian had a good reason for what he was doing, that the police were prepared to be careful and to consider that, right? That seemed to be their modus operandi. Did it work? No. So whatever the law says about the situation, I don't think it takes a genius to be suspicious. Why would you lawyer up if you had nothing to hide? And the attorney says, well, automatically in a situation like this, people's suspicion turn to family members, right? Well, yes, because that is typically what is happening, and isn't that what happened here? So is the logic irrational in this case? But it is quite a clever defense to say, well, because of the statistical thing, were you going to automatically protect the parents from saying anything? But at the same time, if they're innocent, well, aren't you going to want them to clear their names if they are innocent? Wouldn't you want them to talk to clear their names? But you might say, well, talking would implicate them, kind of thing. So it's kind of an interesting legal conundrum, but which works quite well from a defense perspective. Obviously, if you're a prosecutor and you have a client that is innocent, right? And I know it doesn't work like that because you have a defense person or whatever, but in any event, if you're a prosecutor and you've got a witness, let's say, who's innocent, then you would want them to talk. You'd want them to be transparent, especially if it was provably, demonstrably true. Now, consider the obvious but overlooked point. Brian Laundrie himself returned from one crime scene directly to his parents' home, and by doing this, he involved his parents in the immediate aftermath of his crime. He made his parents accessories of a sort. I'm not saying that they knew that they were accessories, but indirectly, by implication, he made his parents accessories of a sort. The question is how much they knew or ought to have known. I mean, he also returned home shortly after the Moab incident. Didn't he tell them about that? When their own son disappeared and the Laundries continued to not speak to authorities. So when their own son disappears, aren't his parents going to be thinking, surely he has done something, right? And of course, again, you can use that whole idea of, you can't make that assumption. But there is that sort of general assumption that if you guilty, why run? Why would you be a fugitive? And that brings up the whole Harrison Ford scenario in The Fugitive, where he was actually innocent, but he was on the run. But that's a little bit different, where there's a very clear sense of being framed, and he was framed in that situation, and a very clear sense of peril. In that case, you actually had him sentenced and offered the opportunity to flee, and then he did it, right? And what did he do? He wanted to talk. He wanted to clear his name. He didn't remain silent. I'm talking about the movie version. So the Laundries not speaking to the authorities effectively facilitated not just his disappearance, Brian's disappearance, but arguably his death as well. This raises an interesting irony. Aside from what the law may say, the Laundries may have felt they had no responsibility towards Gabby, especially in those first days, or for revealing anything about Gabby, especially if it might implicate their son. Did they have no feelings of guilt when Brian turned up as a skeleton just 5 minutes' drive from their home? So it's one thing to say they had no responsibility towards Gabby, but didn't have any responsibility towards Brian, and then look at how Brian turned up. So rightly or wrongly, did that same lack of responsibility to Gabby flow on when Brian disappeared? Brian disappeared while temporarily not only in their care, but kind of under the protection of Bertolino, since Bertolino not only counseled Brian's parents, but Brian as well. It does also beg the question, what is the point of lawyering up if not to protect Brian and themselves? And then when Brian disappeared, did the Laundries simply wash their hands and decide to protect themselves? We don't know what Brian's doing. We don't know where he is. We're just going to protect ourselves. Did they absolve themselves of any responsibility towards their son or anyone else? Question mark. Ashley Banfield has made a compelling argument that discussions with the family might not all be privileged, and if so, Bertolino may have some questions to answer as well. And it does appear that that is where we are right now in the Petito case. The Petito family attorney, Richard Stafford, is engaging with Bertolino and the authorities right now. It was interesting how Bertolino responded to recent news of Brian Laundrie's autopsy findings. He said, quote, this was in a statement, Chris and Roberta have been informed about what happened, goes into some detail about what did happen. Then he says, Chris and Roberta are still mourning the loss of their son and are hopeful that these findings bring closure to both families, end quote. And so you can see a parallel there with the Petitos. Obviously, the Petitos are also mourning the loss of their daughter. And it's almost like, well, surely this should bring closure to them as well. In effect, I think Bertolino is hoping that Brian's death will be sort of the end of the road legally for his clients and himself. I think that's his position. He wants closure. They want closure. They want this to be the end. He's hoping that it all stops here, really, even before the contents of the notebook are revealed. Meanwhile, Gabby's family are perhaps left with a decision, along with the authorities, to decide whether to continue the investigation and yes, if further charges ought to be brought. And the attorney, Mr. Stafford, I think, released this statement. He said, quote, "The family was asked to not comment and let the FBI continue the investigation and allow the United States Attorney's Office to make a determination whether any additional individuals will be charged," end quote. My position is that regardless of what happened after Gabby's murder, Gabby was murdered, and her death should be treated like any other criminal investigation. Find out what happened, who did what, and why. There may be a temptation to grieve right now. There may be a temptation to put the difficult process the parents are going through behind them. But the reality is the sadness will last forever, and the grief will be worse without knowing the answers to basic questions. And so it does also raise this question, should one let it be? These words tattooed on Gabby's forearm as well as on her family's forearms now as well. Let it be. Should this whole thing of additional individuals be charged, or should one let it be? What do you guys think? Well, I think closure in a case like this never really happens. The best way to honor Gabby is to find out what happened to her and why. Which is to say, in terms of the investigation, don't let it be. Pursue justice. Ask questions, get the answers. Doesn't Gabby deserve that? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.